Climate change threatens every one of us. But what would you sacrifice if giving something up could solve the climate crisis? We've done a big survey in every European Union country, in China, in the US, and in Britain, to find out what people are ready to do to fight climate change, to understand what solutions they think will work and whether they're even worried at all about climate change now that COVID-19 threatens us. Then we spoke to experts about what it all means for the future of our planet. I'm Matt, and this is Climate Solutions. Today, I get around, travel into the future. In the 1960s, the Beach Boys released a string of no fewer than 8 songs about cars and motorbikes. Little Deuce Coupe, Fun 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 Till Her Daddy Takes the T-Bird Away, the quaintly named Little Honda, which they sang was as much fun as a barrel of monkeys, and of course, I Get Around, in which they recounted their adventures, picking up lots of women and scaring the bad guys by being tough. For Californian pop singers back then, combustion engines meant freedom and speed, and they were cool. How times change. If there were a contemporary equivalent of the Beach Boys, they'd be singing about their monthly bus tickets and offering to take their girlfriends for a ride on an electric bike. Now that really does sound like as much fun as a barrel of monkeys. But the changes in the way we get around are not finished. Total global emissions come from a few main areas of human activity: energy, industry, agriculture, and transport. Aviation alone is responsible for around 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions each year. That might not sound like much, particularly when you compare it to the total of 40 billion tons of carbon emitted globally, but it has been growing since the 1990s, whereas a lot of other polluting industries have been cutting emissions. The European Investment Bank's climate survey asked 30,000 people in the European Union, China, the US, and the UK about changes they were making or would be prepared to make in the way they move from place to place, and what they think is needed to make mobility clean and green instead of being one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions. Adelaide Zulfikar-Pasik is Director of Opinion Polls at BVA, the Paris company that carried out the survey for the European Investment Bank. The survey found that 67% of Europeans say they're less likely to use public transport now because of health concerns. That is, they're worried they might contract COVID on the bus. In the US and China, that number was even higher, 71% for Americans and 75% for Chinese. I asked Adelaide about the impact of COVID-19 on people's attitudes to travel and how that might play out in the future.
People became unaccustomed to flying because there are less flying, as you know. And these people say for part of them that they might not return to their previous habits. When COVID-19 related restrictions are lifted, only a minority of Europeans, of Chinese citizens, and also of Americans say that they will return to their previous travel habits and that they will travel by plane as they did before the pandemic. So I think that on the contrary, this would be rather good news for the environment.
Our survey found that 82% of Europeans were willing to take their holidays close to home rather than traveling a great distance and causing a lot of emissions. In China, that was even a little higher, while 69% of Americans agreed. 74% of Europeans intend to fly less compared to 70% of Americans and 80% of Chinese. Trains are a big winner. For trips that take 5 hours or less, 71% of Europeans would prefer to take the train. In China, that was 83%. Even in America, it was 53%. While slightly more than half of the people surveyed said they would agree to pay a carbon offset for their flights, only around 20% said they were actually doing that. The survey shows people aren't so interested in paying a fee to offset the carbon emissions from flying. They'd rather just not fly.
Everywhere in the world, respondents say that it would be easiest to stop flying than anything else, far ahead of giving up video streaming or giving up buying new clothes or giving up meat. You're right, carbon offsets ranks last in the list, but maybe for 2 reasons. Because this action is not concrete enough compared with other actions such as giving up the trip of your dream or taking the train. So it's not concrete. And a second reason, I think it's on the contrary good news, because I have the feeling that carbon offsets could appear as a bit too easy, asking very few efforts. You have to pay, but you have no renouncement, no sacrifice. So on the contrary, I see that's rather as a good news.
In our last episode, we looked at the role price will play in stopping climate change. In other words, if something is bad for the climate, it should gradually become more expensive. Or if it's good for the climate, it should become gradually cheaper, so that consumers will naturally make the right choice. That's true in mobility too. Edward Calthorpe is head of the Climate Policy Unit at the European Investment Bank. The EIB, as it's known, makes loans on behalf of the European Union. It lends to all kinds of transport companies and authorities, from research into electric cars to big new rolling stock for the railways. How does the European Union's Climate Bank see the future of transport?
So the issue of our support to the transport sector generally, and I mean airports and airplanes in particular, came up and featured fairly strongly in our public consultation around the Climate Bank roadmap. And of course, this was, the challenge was indeed to strike the right balance in focusing EIB support most productively within these sectors. Rail is largely electrified, so we don't see there's no particular climate issue there. Moreover, as you're saying, we're expecting strong growth in the next few years. The Commission, in particular, in their recently released smart and sustainable strategy, are looking at high-speed rail traffic doubling by 2030, boosting cross-European connections. At the same time, we have essentially the regulatory environment, this fourth railway package, bedding down, so opening up a little bit the rail market. So EIB has been a traditional supporter of the trans-European rail network, both passenger and freight, and we will continue to do so. I should add that we're actually, in the course of this year, will come forward with a revised transport lending policy, which is precisely looking at how we can really make best use of EIB resources to support that Commission strategy.
And if people don't want to pay to offset carbon emissions, aeroplanes obviously need to get cleaner and greener. What does the future hold there?
Aviation is, of course, more tricky or more sensitive, given that the sector is associated with increasing emissions, with large amounts of emissions. And although the technology pathway is as such kind of clear, it's going to take some years, some decades before there's a credible chance of getting on a long-haul flight and not resulting in emissions of CO2. The question for us is really, we have fixed resources. How can we best target that really to help the long-term objectives of policy? We need more R&D into low-carbon technologies, not just the big manufacturers, but the whole chain. So EIB will continue will focus on that, but really on the low-carbon side, and step away from the conventional technologies. That's the first point. The second point was really around the airport side, which clearly in some sense airports are not directly emitting. They're basically using electricity, so there's not much direct emissions there. The emissions are from the planes, but obviously it's part of an integrated system. We've come to the view that we will continue to support investment in airports, but we will focus that really around greening airports, around making them safer, around improving security. We'll step back from projects really designed to expand capacity at airports.
One of the most interesting possible paths for aviation to take is powering future aeroplanes with hydrogen, which, incidentally, can come in different colors based on how clean they are.
hydrogen can be manufactured from, it's essentially two ways of manufacturing. The very old technology is just electrolysis, so basically running electricity through water H2O, and that can running the electricity through the water through the electrolysis process divides it into hydrogen with a waste product of oxygen. So that if you do that with green electricity, essentially you've produced hydrogen with no emissions of carbon. The alternative, the existing, is usually through a process called steam methane reforming. That is basically generating the hydrogen out of hydrocarbons. And so the waste product there, put very simply, is carbon dioxide. So unless you can capture that and store it, you end up with a carbon emission. So there's quite a rich terminology out there at the moment, but essentially when people are referring to low carbon hydrogen, they're usually referring to either the electrolysis from renewable power, or potentially they're referring to steam methane reforming, but then with a technology slotted in to capture that carbon. So this is known as blue hydrogen. So we have green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, both of which are being looked at very seriously in different parts of Europe. And that's in contrast to, let's call it grey hydrogen, which is existing where the CO2 is just vented into the atmosphere.
You'll remember that when our survey asked people what would be the hardest thing to give up to stop climate change, we offered them the choice of giving up new clothes, red meat, streaming video, taking exotic trips. But the hardest thing to give up, by quite a long way, they said, for most people in Europe and the United States, was the car. So what's going to happen to cars? Will they all become electric? Will they disappear and we'll all take public transport? Will they become smaller to consume less energy? I asked Ed Calthorpe.
You have the sense that electric cars are on the cusp of breaking through. Depends a bit on your needs, your use, whether you're traveling regularly long distances, short distances, etc. But I mean, there's plenty of studies out there showing essentially that taken on a sort of lifetime basis, we're getting close to the point where for some parts of the market, electric vehicles are cost competitive with conventionals. I mean, you may have to pay a bit higher up front, but the running costs, the operating costs will be lower. So we're close to it now. Why are we close to it now? We've seen, just an astonishing reduction in the cost of lithium-ion batteries over the last decade. They've essentially come down by an order of magnitude. And so no, look, I think the prospects on electric vehicles are very strong.
Most days I get to work on my bike. I have to take a fairly indirect route, though, because I want to avoid busy roads, because they're dangerous, and there are no real bike lanes like the ones you see for cyclists in the Netherlands. That's a common problem all over Europe and the world, actually, and it's shared by Ed, whose family home is in Belgium.
It's a network phenomenon, so what's important is the weakest link in the network. And so investment in that is important. So I'll give you a very simple example, which is actually with the kids, we're about 10 kilometers out from one of the local cities. And essentially there's two stretches. One stretch is around 5 kilometers, is through country lanes and is very pleasant. And the second half is another 5 kilometers, essentially following an old disused railway line. So it all sounds good stuff, but the problem is to get from the first 5 kilometers to the second 5 kilometers, we have to cross an incredibly busy and dangerous road. And as a result, our family use of cycling down to the local town is definitely suboptimal. So infrastructure is hugely important. I think it's really around, as I say, it's around developing coherent networks that really focus on, perhaps as much as anything, eliminating the weak points on those networks.
COVID-19 has a part to play here. If people worry about catching COVID-19 when they catch the bus, the bike becomes a good alternative. 73% of Europeans say they cycle and walk more now because it's safer than public transport as they see it. In the US, that's 69%, and in China, 89%. But there are big differences between countries when it comes to commuting by bike. In the US and the UK, only 11% of people said nothing was holding them back from commuting by bike. In the EU, that was at 15% overall, but with a big range. In the famously bike-friendly Netherlands, 35% of people said nothing was holding them back from commuting by bike. At the other end of the scale, at 2, 3, and 4%, were Cyprus, Malta, and Luxembourg. Distance is, no doubt, something that holds people back, as well as poor infrastructure. So does an electric bike, which makes it easier to pedal over that long distance, make it more likely that people will take slightly longer bike rides?
Electric bikes is an interesting one, and I think it certainly is changing. Certainly for, just personal experience, but the number of colleagues who are able to commute in that sort of 10, 15 kilometre radius, which, let's be honest, is a bit arduous on an ordinary bike, becomes much easier on an electric bike. So I think, again, in certain segments of the market, it will be we're seeing them roll out very fast. And again, same phenomena, battery costs are falling, technology improving. So, I think there's certainly plenty of governments that have looked at subsidizing electric bikes. But I think we'll soon be in a situation where that just takes care of itself.
And then we can all have as much fun as a barrel of monkeys, just like the Beach Boys on their little Honda, but without harming the environment. Subscribe to Climate Solutions so you don't miss any of the results of the climate survey or the explanations of our experts. You can also read the full results of the climate survey at eib.org, eib.org. In the next episode of Climate Solutions, you'll find out what young people think about climate change and how that compares with the views of old people. You might be in for a few surprises, by the way. So discover whether you agree with the 30,000 people in our survey on the next episode of Climate Solutions from the European Investment Bank, the EU Bank.